The fire has been breathing in the corner of this stone room for 48 hours now, and I have forgotten what it feels like to have eyes that do not sting from the charcoal smoke. You might imagine a laboratory to be a place of sudden light or golden transformation, but it is, in truth, a place of grey dust and the endless scrubbing of glass. My hands are stained a permanent deep yellow from the sulphur, a colour that no amount of lye or river water can lift from the skin. Today, like every Tuesday for the last 4 months, I am preoccupied with the calcination of lead. It is a slow, silent process. I sit on a 3-legged stool that wobbles on the uneven masonry, watching the metal lose its luster in the heat, turning slowly from a dull silver into a powdery pale ash. There is no poetry in it. There is only the sound of the bellows, hiss, thud, hiss, thud, and the occasional crackle of the green wood I was forced to buy because the seasoned oak has become too expensive in the city markets this winter. My back aches from leaning over the athanor. To be an alchemist is to be a servant to a furnace that never sleeps. I must maintain the heat at a precise low simmer. If the coals grow too cold, the work of a week is undone. If they grow too hot, the glass vessel will shatter, and I will be forced to spend the next 3 days picking shards out of the ash and sweeping the floor. I find myself counting the bricks in the wall to pass the time. 112 on the north side, near the window where the pale winter light barely reaches my scales. I have spent the morning weighing out dried bay salt and saltpeter, a task that requires a steady hand and a tolerance for the sharp, stinging scent that fills the back of the throat. I use a small bone spoon, worn smooth at the edges from years of friction, transferring the white crystals grain by grain until the balance hangs perfectly level. The air is heavy with the smell of vinegar and damp wool. Outside, I can hear the distant sound of a cartwheel creaking on the cobblestones and the muffled shouts of the fishmongers. But in here, time has a different weight. It stretches out like the cooling glass in a blower's pipe. I am currently waiting for a solution of vitriol to filter through a cone of thick linen. It drips, 1 drop every 10 seconds. I have timed it by the pulse in my wrist. Drip, 10 seconds of silence. Drip, another 10 seconds. It will take until sunset for the jar to fill, and only then can I begin the next stage of evaporation, which will, in turn, take another 12 hours of sitting, watching and feeding the fire, one small splinter of wood at a time. My eyes wander to the soot on the ceiling, tracing the patterns where the smoke has swirled into dark, stagnant clouds. This is the great work. It is not the finding of gold, but the losing of oneself in the grey, repetitive motions of the heat and the cold, the pouring and the scraping, the endless quiet, waiting for a change that may never come. The rhythmic scraping of the pestle against the interior of the marble mortar is the only music I have known since the sun began its slow ascent over the cathedral spires. It is a dull, grinding sound, a low vibration that travels up my arms and settles into my shoulders, a physical reminder of the hours spent reducing cinnabar to a fine, uniform scarlet powder. To the uninitiated, the color is vibrant, almost beautiful, but to me, it is merely a measurement of labor. I must ensure there is not a single grit, not a single grain larger than a speck of dust, for the fire is unforgiving of inconsistency. I pause only to wipe the sweat from my brow with a sleeve, already stiffened by dried paste and salt. My neck is stiff from the downward gaze, and my fingers have grown cramped into a permanent claw around the heavy stone handle. There is a specific, suffocating stillness in this chamber, where the only movement is the dancing of dust motes in a single shaft of light that has managed to pierce through the grime of the high window. I watch them drift, envious of their weightlessness, before my attention is pulled back to the charcoal brazier. I must now prepare the loot, a thick sticky paste of clay, horsehair, and dung, to seal the joints of the alembic. It is a messy, foul-smelling necessity. I knead the mixture between my palms, feeling the coarse fibers of the hair and the damp grit of the earth, ensuring the consistency is just right, so that no precious vapors escape during the distillation. If the seal leaks, even by a hair's breadth, the pressure will fail, and the day's heating will be wasted. I apply the grey sludge to the glass seams with a flat wooden spatula, smoothing it over and over until the seal is thick and airtight. It is a task that leaves my cuticles cracked and my fingernails rimmed with black mud. Once the sealing is done, I must wait for it to dry naturally, before the heat can be increased. This waiting is a physical wait. I sit back on the stool and reach for a stack of parchment, not to record a great discovery, but to meticulously log the price of the wine I bought for the spirit of vinegar, and the weight of the coal consumed since Sunday. The ink is thin and pale. I must grind more oak galls tomorrow. I stare at the rows of figures, the mundane arithmetic of a life spent in pursuit of the infinitesimal. My gaze drifts to the shelf of empty glass vials, each one requiring a thorough rinsing with sand and water to remove the residue of previous failures. I take a handful of fine river sand and drop it into a narrow-necked flask, adding a splash of water and shaking it with a rhythmic, circular motion. Swish, rattle, swish, the sand scours the glass, a tedious friction that occupies another 20 minutes of my existence. There is no shortcut. There is no hidden word that cleans the glass or grinds the stone. There is only the repetition of the hand, the slow passage of the shadow across the floor, and the heavy, humid air that smells of wet earth and cooling metal. I find myself staring at a small crack in the floorboards, wondering how many years of spilled water and dropped embers it took to create that particular shape, lost in a trance of boredom that is as deep and vast as the ocean, while the fire continues its low, indifferent hum in the corner. The sun has shifted further across the floor, and the shaft of light has moved from the mortar to the corner, where the tall, copper-bound barrels of rainwater sit. Rainwater collected over 3 weeks of a drizzling autumn must be filtered through layers of fine sand and crushed charcoal to be pure enough for the next dissolution. I take a small wooden ladle and begin the transfer, pint by pint, into a wide-mouthed ceramic jar. The water is cold, numbing my fingertips, and it makes a hollow echoing splash against the bottom of the vessel. Splash, pause, pour. My mind drifts to the tally I keep on the wall behind the door, marking the days since I last left this street. It has been 14. The world outside is a distant memory of noise and movement, while my world is defined by the slow evaporation of a brine solution over a bed of warm ashes. I check the temperature of the ash by dipping a finger into the edge of the tray. It must be no hotter than the blood of a healthy man. I adjust the ventilation holes at the base of the furnace, sliding a small iron plate a fraction of an inch to the left to dampen the draft. This is the precision of alchemy. not the waving of a wand, but the sliding of a metal plate, and the waiting for the air to react. I spend the next hour seated on the floor, sorting through a bundle of dried herbs that arrived in a damp burlap sack. I must separate the leaves from the woody stems of the wormwood and the hyssop. My fingers become sticky with a bitter, dark resin that smells of old forests and decay. I pick through the pile, leaf by leaf, discarding those that show signs of mold or the nibbling of insects. It is a task that requires no thought, only a mindless rhythmic picking that allows the hours to dissolve into one another. My vision blurs slightly from the constant focus on the small grey-green flakes. Once sorted, the leaves must be placed in a glass cucurbit and covered with the prepared spirit of wine. I pour the liquid slowly, watching it rise through the dry leaves, displacing the air in tiny silver bubbles that cling to the sides of the glass. I then take a long glass rod and stir the mixture. 100 revolutions to the right, followed by 100 to the left. I count them under my breath, my voice a dry rasp in the silent room. 98, 99, 100. The resistance of the liquid is slight, but after several hundred turns, my wrist begins to throb with a dull, familiar ache. When the stirring is done, the vessel must be capped with a bladder skin, tied tightly with a hemp cord, and placed in the corner to macerate for 40 days. I carry the heavy glass jar to its spot on the lowest shelf, careful not to trip over the piles of firewood. The shelf is already crowded with similar jars, all marked with small, faded labels of parchment. I spend a moment adjusting them, aligning the labels so they all face outward. A small act of order in a life governed by the chaotic behavior of heat and matter. I notice a thin layer of dust has settled on the jars since yesterday. And so I take a dry rag and begin to wipe them, one by one. The glass is cool and smooth under the cloth. I work slowly, moving the rag in slow circles, feeling the shape of the vessels, the slight imperfections in the glass, the small bubbles trapped in the frozen liquid of the jar's wall. It is a meditation of the mundane. By the time the third shelf is clean, the light in the room has turned a deep, bruised purple, signaling the arrival of the evening. The fire in the furnace needs more fuel. I pick up the heavy iron tongs and begin to move the glowing coals, rearranging the heart of the heat to ensure it will last through the night without flickering out. It is a delicate architecture of embers, a city of fire that I build and rebuild every single evening of my life, only to watch it turn to grey ash by the morning. The transition from twilight into the deep, unchanging dark of the laboratory night is marked only by the shifting smell of the air, as the scent of cooling stone replaces the scent of sun-baked dust. I light a single tallow candle, its flame a weak flickering amber orb that barely reaches the edges of my workbench. The wax is poor quality, smelling faintly of the slaughterhouse, and it drips in a slow, irregular rhythm onto the wooden surface, forming a white, waxy mountain that I will have to scrape away with a knife tomorrow morning. I do not need much light for the task at hand, which is the long silent vigil over the digestion. I have a glass pelican, a curious circular vessel with two curved arms that feed back into the body, sitting in a sandbar. Inside, a mixture of lead acetate and distilled vinegar is supposed to circulate, rising as vapor and falling back as liquid in a continuous closed loop. It is a process of endless return. I sit and watch the condensation form on the inner walls of the glass. First a thin mist, then tiny individual spheres of moisture that gradually grow heavy enough to slide down the neck and rejoin the pool at the bottom. I follow a single drop with my eyes. It takes nearly 3 minutes for it to gather enough weight to fall. I wait for the next one. This is the true nature of my craft, the observation of things that do not want to change. My breathing slows to match the pulse of the furnace. To keep myself awake, I begin the task of sharpening my iron scrapers and the small curved knives I use for paring the wicks of the lamps. I take a whetstone, a flat slab of grey slate, and apply a few drops of linseed oil. The sound of metal on stone, sh-t, is sharp and rhythmic, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. I move the blade in long diagonal strokes, feeling for the slight burr on the edge, then flipping it over to repeat the motion on the other side. It is a mindless mechanical labor. My mind wanders to the ledger of my life, a series of years spent in this basement, while empires rise and fall above the ground. I think of the thousands of pounds of charcoal I have shoveled, the countless gallons of water I have hauled from the well, the hundreds of glass vessels I have washed, dried, and broken. I reach into a wooden bin and pull out a handful of raw alum. It is cold and jagged. I begin to break the larger chunks into smaller pieces using a brass hammer, striking with just enough force to crack the crystal, but not so much that the shards fly across the room. Clink, clink, clink. Each strike vibrates through my thumb and forefinger. I sort the pieces by size, placing the small ones in a leather pouch and the larger ones back into the bin. My shadow, cast long and distorted by the candle against the damp stone wall, mimics my movements like a silent giant twin. I feel the cold from the floor seeping through my wool hosen and into my knees, a damp chill that seems to originate from the very earth beneath the foundations. I stand up to stretch, my joints popping with the sound of dry twigs breaking, and walk the 3 paces to the window. The moon is obscured by clouds, but I can see the faint, ghostly reflection of my own face in the glass. Tired eyes, a beard dusted with white ash, a forehead lined by the habit of squinting at small things. I return to my stool. I take a small brush made of pig bristles and begin to clean the scales, whisking away the microscopic remnants of yesterday's antimony. Every grain must be removed, for the balance is a sensitive, fickle thing that can be tilted by the weight of a single hair. I brush the brass pans until they gleam in the candlelight. Then I check the silk threads that hold them. They are fraying. I will have to spend an hour tomorrow evening spinning new silk, or finding a merchant who sells the fine Cordovan thread. I sit back down and watch the furnace. The glow from the intake hole is a deep, comforting crimson. I realize I have been staring at it for an hour without moving a single muscle. My thoughts have become as slow and viscous as the honey I use to bind the herbal pills. There is no excitement here, no revelation. Only the heavy, quiet accumulation of minutes and hours, the steady consumption of fuel, and the slow, inevitable aging of the man and the stone alike. The stillness of the middle night is different from the stillness of the day. It is thicker, pressing against the eardrums like the weight of deep water. The candle has burned down to a guttering stub, swimming in its own liquid fat, and the light it casts is now so rhythmic and pulsing that the shadows of the glass retorts on the shelves seem to breathe against the lime-washed walls. I reach for a heavy iron mortar, not to grind, but to use as a weight to press a stack of thick handmade paper I have soaked in a solution of alum and gum arabic. The paper must be perfectly flat for the diagrams I will never draw, or for the recipes I have already memorized, but feel the duty to preserve. I spend a long time smoothing the damp sheets with the side of my thumb, feeling the texture of the fibers, the small lumps of undissolved rag, and the faint scent of the vat. Each sheet is a slow, deliberate movement. When the stack is aligned, I place a smooth oak board on top, and then the heavy mortar, feeling the resistance of the wood. My hands are beginning to tremble slightly from the lack of sleep. A fine tremor that makes the handling of thin glass a dangerous prospect. I decide, therefore, to turn my attention to the heap of charcoal in the corner. It must be sorted. Not all coal is equal. The small brittle pieces burn too quickly and create a spike in heat that can crack a crucible, while the large, dense chunks are needed for the long, steady burns of the night watch. I sit on the floor, the cold stone biting through my garments, and begin to move the black stones from one pile to another. My fingers are quickly coated in a fine, greasy soot that works its way into the deep lines of my palms and under my nails. Scrape, clack, thud. I pick up a piece, weigh it in my hand, judge its density by the way it catches the candlelight, and set it in its respective heap. It is a grimy, lowly task, the work of a stable boy or a kitchen thrall. Yet here I am, a man of the secret arts, spent in the labor of a coal heaver. I find a certain numb comfort in it. The repetition acts as a tether to reality. After the coal is sorted, I must attend to the water clock I use to time the more delicate distillations. It is a simple device, a copper bowl with a tiny hole in the bottom, floating in a larger vat. I watch it sink. It takes exactly 15 minutes for the bowl to submerge. I lift it out, empty the water back into the vat, and place it on the surface again. Splash! The ripples hit the side of the vat and return, a miniature tide in a world of stone. I do this 4 times, marking an hour of my life that has vanished into the shadows. I then move to the back of the room, where the earthen jars of acids are kept, buried in boxes of dry sand to prevent breakage. I must check the stoppers. Some are made of wax, some of ground glass, and some of simple cork wrapped in bladder. I twist each one, ensuring the seal has not been eaten away by the corrosive spirit within. The smell of vitriol is faint but sharp, a metallic tang that pricks the nostrils and brings a sour taste to the tongue. I find one jar where the wax has become brittle and cracked. I take a small iron pot, place it on the edge of the furnace, and wait for a lump of beeswax to melt. I watch the solid block lose its shape, the edges softening, turning from a pale yellow to a clear, oily gold. I use a small brush to paint the melted wax over the stopper, layer after layer, watching it go opaque as it cools and hardens. It is a slow, protective ritual. My mind is a blank slate, occupied only by the thickness of the wax and the heat of the iron pot. I am waiting for the dawn, not because it brings an end to my work, but because it brings enough light to see the graduation marks on my glass cylinders without straining. I lean my head against the cool stone of the pillar, listening to the internal life of the laboratory, the cooling contraction of the furnace bricks, the faint hiss of the boiling vinegar, the scuttle of a mouse in the grain sack. This is the alchemy of the mundane, the slow dissolution of a human soul into the rhythm of the fire and the glass, a process that requires no gold, only an infinite staggering amount of patience. The grey light of the false dawn begins to bleed through the high, narrow slit of the window. not as a sudden brightness, but as a slow thinning of the shadows, turning the laboratory from a cavern of black ink into a room of cold, slate-colored shapes. This is the hour when the cold is most aggressive, a damp, heavy chill that seems to rise directly from the earth and settle into the marrow of my bones. My breath hangs in the air in faint, disappearing plumes. I move to the corner where the sacks of botanical materials are stored and retrieve a heavy bundle of dried oak bark. It is rough and desiccated, smelling of old forests and tannins. I begin the process of breaking it into small uniform pieces using a pair of iron shears. The sound is a repetitive, dry snap, 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 the sound of wood surrendering. I must be careful to remove any moss or lichen that clings to the exterior, as these impurities would cloud the extract. I use a small, stiff-bristled brush to scrub each piece of bark, a process that takes nearly an hour for a single pound of material. My fingers are numb, the tips turning a pale, bloodless blue. But the movement of the shears provides a small mechanical heat. Once the bark is prepared, I must weigh it on the large beam scales. I add the iron weights one by one, the 1 pound, the ½ pound, the 2 ounce, until the arm of the scale oscillates slowly and finally comes to rest in a perfect horizontal line. I stare at that line for a long time, mesmerized by the absolute stillness of the balance. There is a profound, exhausting silence in the precision of the weight. I then transfer the bark into a large copper cauldron and begin to add the spring water I fetched yesterday evening. I do not pour it all at once. I add it in measured increments, stirring with a long oaken paddle to ensure every piece of bark is thoroughly wetted. The water turns a pale, muddy brown, a color that reminds me of the winter rose. I place the cauldron over a secondary fire. Not the intense heat of the furnace, but a low, simmering flame that must be maintained for 6 hours. I sit by the fire, the paddle resting in my hands, and I begin the slow, rhythmic stirring. I count the rotations. 1, 2, 3, watching the small whirlpools form in the center of the pot. The steam begins to rise, carrying with it the heavy, astringent scent of the oak. It fills the room, clinging to my clothes and my hair, a scent of damp permanence. To occupy my mind during this long vigil, I begin to clean the collection of iron spatulas that have accumulated a crust of dried oxides. I take a piece of pumice stone and a jar of fine oil, and I rub the metal. Back and forth, the pumice grinds against the iron, slowly wearing away the rust and the grime, until the grey metal beneath begins to show. It is a slow, abrasive labor that requires a steady, downward pressure. I focus on a single spot of rust, a stubborn red blemish on the blade, and I rub it until my arm muscles ache and my shoulder begins to throb. After 30 minutes of concentrated effort, the spot is gone, and I move to the next. This is the reality of the great work, the endless maintenance of tools, the scrubbing of surfaces, the management of heat. I look at the floor and notice a small trail of ants moving across the stone, attracted perhaps by a drop of spilled honey from days ago. I watch them for a long time, fascinated by their tiny, frantic industry, which seems so similar to my own. They move with purpose, carrying burdens twice their size, disappearing into a crack in the masonry, only to return for more. I realize that I have been sitting here for 2 hours, and the only thing that has changed is that the water in the cauldron has darkened by a single shade of brown, and the sun has climbed high enough to illuminate the cobwebs in the rafters. The spider that lives above the bellows has caught a moth. It is a grey, motionless lump in the silk. I turn back to the cauldron and resume my stirring, the paddle moving through the thickening liquid with a slight, heavy resistance. 1, 2, 3. The morning has fully arrived, but in here the only clock is the slow darkening of the infusion and the steady, indifferent consumption of the wood by the flame. The decoction has finally reached the necessary density, and now begins the most grueling and unglamorous stage. The filtration of the sludge. I lift the heavy copper cauldron from the hook, my muscles tensing, my breath hitching as the weight pulls at my lower back, and carry it over to the wooden filtration rack. The rack holds a series of funnel-shaped linen bags, coarse at the top and becoming progressively finer toward the bottom. I begin to pour. The liquid does not flow freely. It is thick with particulate matter, a muddy, silt-heavy soup that immediately begins to clog the pores of the fabric. I must stand there with a wooden masher, gently pressing the sodden bark against the sides of the linen to force the moisture through. Squelch, drip, squelch. It is a wet, repetitive sound that fills the small chamber. My boots are soon splattered with the dark brown liquid, and the hem of my robe is soaked through, clinging to my ankles with a cold, abrasive weight. I spend nearly 3 hours at this task alone, waiting for the gravity to do what my hands cannot. Between pourings, I turn my attention to the collection of animal bladders that have been soaking in a tub of brine to keep them supple. These are the membranes I use to seal my vessels against the escape of volatile spirits. I pull one from the salt water. It is pale, translucent, and incredibly slippery. I must scrape away the last vestiges of fat and tissue using a dull bone knife. It is a delicate, nauseating task that requires a light touch. If I scrape too hard, the membrane tears and becomes useless. If I am too gentle, the fat will rot and ruin the chemical purity of my work. I hold the wet, translucent skin against the light of the window, looking for imperfections, for pinpricks of light that signal a leak. I find one, sigh, and toss the bladder into the waste bucket, to be burned with the charcoal scraps. I start on the next one. This is the truth of my days. For every hour of intellectual pursuit, there are 10 hours of manual menial labor that would make a tanner or a butcher weary. My neck is permanently bowed from this labor, my eyes perpetually narrowed. I move to the workbench to prepare the glass retorts for the afternoon's distillation. Each vessel must be polished with a mixture of fine ash and wine spirit to remove the oily residue of my own fingerprints. I take a soft rag and rub the glass in circular motions, over and over until the surface squeaks under the friction. I hold the glass up to my eye, checking the curve for any hairline fractures born of thermal stress. A single crack, invisible to the naked eye, could mean a catastrophic explosion once the pressure builds. I find a small scratch near the neck of the largest retort and spend the next 40 minutes rubbing it with a slurry of powdered emery, trying to smooth it away so the stress does not concentrate there. The sound is a high-pitched grating whine, scree, 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 that vibrates through my teeth and into my skull. My world has narrowed to the diameter of a glass neck and the grit of the emery powder. The sun is now directly overhead, casting the shortest shadows of the day. Yet the laboratory remains a place of perpetual autumn, damp and dim. I realize I have not eaten since yesterday's crust of bread, but the thought of food is distant. eclipsed by the need to check the level of the liquid in the receiving jars. I kneel on the floor, my knees clicking like dry dice, and peer at the meniscus of the fluid. It has barely moved. The distillation is proceeding with an agonizing glacial slowness. I sit on the floor, leaning my head against the cold wood of the rack, and listen to the slow plink, plink, plink of the filtered extract hitting the ceramic jar below. I count the drops to keep from falling into a heavy, unproductive sleep. 100 drops is a minute. 6,000 drops is an hour. I have many thousands of drops to go before the sun touches the horizon. The afternoon heat begins to settle into the upper reaches of the laboratory. A stagnant, airless warmth that mixes unpleasantly with the dampness of the floor. My task now is the rectification, the repeated distillation of the same spirit to achieve a higher degree of purity. It is the pinnacle of redundancy. I take the clear liquid I spent the morning extracting and pour it back into the clean alembic, starting the entire process over again. I check the sand bath. The sand must be perfectly dry and level, so I use a flat wooden lathe to smooth it out, drawing the wood across the surface until the grey grains are as flat as a frozen pond. I nestle the glass bulb into the center, wiggling it slightly until it is seated firmly in the grit. I then begin the slow process of building the fire back up, one small splinter of pine at a time. I do not want a blaze. I want a whisper of heat. I sit and watch the thermometer, a simple, unreliable thing of expanding metal, waiting for the first sign of movement. My eyes are heavy, the lids feeling as though they have been dusted with the very sand I just leveled. To stay awake, I reach for a basket of unwashed minerals, raw sulfur from the volcanic vents of the south. It arrives in jagged yellow lumps that are covered in a fine, choking dust. I must wash each lump in a bowl of weak vinegar to remove the surface impurities. I dip my hands into the stinging liquid, feeling it find every small cut and abrasion on my skin. I pick up a piece of sulfur, rub it with a stiff brush, and set it on a clean linen cloth to dry. Scrub, rinse, set. Scrub, rinse, set. The smell of rotting eggs fills the room, a sharp, cloying odor that clings to the back of the tongue and makes every breath feel heavy. I have washed 30 pieces, and there are 30 more in the basket. The repetition is so absolute that I lose track of which pieces are clean and which are soiled, forced to start the entire pile over again, just to be certain. My mind becomes a void, a hollow space where only the sound of the water and the scratching of the brush exist. I look over at the alembic. A single bead of moisture has appeared in the neck. I watch it. It does not move for 5 minutes. It sits there, a tiny, defiant pearl of liquid, refusing to succumb to gravity. I find myself leaning forward, my nose inches from the glass, breathing softly so as not to fog the surface, staring at that one drop with a focus that borders on the religious. When it finally slides down the glass, I feel a strange, hollow sense of achievement, a fleeting spark of interest that is immediately extinguished by the realization that there are thousands more to follow. I return to the sulfur. My back has developed a sharp stabbing pain just below the shoulder blade, the result of hours spent hunched over the low benches. I stand and walk the length of the room, 5 paces to the door, 5 paces back to the furnace. I do this 20 times, counting each step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, turn. The floorboards creak in the same places every time. I know exactly which board will groan and which will remain silent. This is the geometry of my confinement. I stop to check the tallow lamp, trimming the wick with a pair of snips so the flame does not smoke. The charred bit of wick falls into the oil with a tiny, sizzling sound. I then begin the task of grinding charcoal into a powder for the next day's filters. I use a heavy iron pestle and a deep mortar. The work is loud and dusty, a rhythmic thump, grind, that jars my elbows and fills the air with a black mist. Within minutes, my face is covered in a fine layer of soot, making me look like a ghost of the coal mines. I breathe through a damp cloth tied around my face, the fabric quickly turning black and making each breath a struggle. I grind until my arms are trembling, until the charcoal is as fine as flour, and then I begin to sift it through a silk screen. I shake the screen back and forth, a gentle vibrating motion that sends a cloud of black dust into the air, settling on the tables, the jars, and the folds of my clothes. It is a slow, suffocating labor, a testament to the fact that alchemy is not the study of gold, but the study of dust. By the time the charcoal is sifted, the sun has begun its descent, and the shadow of the window frame has stretched across the entire laboratory. A long, dark finger pointing toward the furnace that I must once again prepare for the evening watch. Dalsha, the sun has now dipped below the horizon of the city's rooftops, and the laboratory has returned to its natural state of deep, amber-hued gloom. The work does not stop for the night. It merely changes its rhythm. I must now perform an inventory of the glassware, a task of immense tedium that I undertake every 10 days to ensure that no microfractures have gone unnoticed. I move to the storage wall, where hundreds of vessels, vials, boltheads, mattresses, and curcubits are nestled in straw-lined cubbyholes. I take them out one by one. I hold each piece of glass up to the light of a small oil lamp, slowly rotating it between my fingers. I am looking for the breadth of the glass, the tiny bubbles or streaks that indicate a point of weakness. My hands move with a practiced mechanical grace, a result of a decade spent handling fragility. Lift, rotate, inspect, replace. It takes 40 seconds per vessel. I have over 200 vessels. I do the math in my head. It will take me more than 2 hours of standing in the silence, moving my arms in the same repetitive arc. My mind begins to drift, wandering through the memories of all the things I have broken. The shattering of a 3-gallon carboy that took 6 months to pay for. The snapping of a delicate stirring rod. I find a small chip in the rim of a narrow-necked flask. I do not discard it. Instead, I take a piece of fine-grained sandstone and begin the slow process of grinding the rim smooth. Grind, dip in water, grind. The sound is a wet, scraping screech that makes the hair on my arms stand up. I work until the edge is dull and safe, my thumb tracing the curve of the glass over and over to feel for any remaining jaggedness. Once the inventory is complete, I must prepare the storage jars for the distillates I created this afternoon. This requires the cutting of fresh parchment labels. I take a large sheet of stiff, yellowed parchment and a heavy pair of iron shears. I cut the sheet into long, thin strips, then into small rectangles. My hand cramps from the force required to slice through the thick skin. I then take a quill and a pot of iron gall ink. I write the names of the substances in a neat, cramped hand: aqua vitae, spiritus Saturni, oleum vitrioli. I write each name 50 times, filling the rectangles with the same repetitive script until the words lose their meaning and become merely patterns of black lines on a tan background. I wait for the ink to dry, blowing softly on the parchment, the scent of the iron and the vinegar from the ink filling my senses. To attach the labels, I must prepare a glue from boiled fish bones. I take a small pot of the dried glue flakes and add a splash of water, placing it on the cooling stones of the furnace. I watch it melt into a thick, sticky, foul-smelling syrup. I use a small brush to apply the glue to the back of each label, then press it onto the cold glass of the jars. I must hold each label in place for 30 seconds to ensure it adheres properly. I count the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 30. I move to the next jar. There are 40 jars. This is another 20 minutes of standing still, my finger pressed against the glass, staring at the wall. My legs feel like pillars of lead, and a dull, throbbing ache has taken residence in my heels. After the labeling is done, I notice that the floor near the furnace has become dusty with ash again. I take a broom made of bundled twigs and begin to sweep. I move the broom in long, slow strokes, pushing the grey dust into a neat pile. I do not rush. There is no reason to rush. The dust rises in the air, catching the lamplight, and I find myself stopping to watch a single flake of ash as it drifts slowly toward the floor. It takes nearly a minute to land. I resume my sweeping. The sound of the twigs against the stone is a dry, rhythmic swish, swish, swish. When the pile is gathered, I scoop it up with a flat iron shovel and carry it to the ash bin. I then take a damp rag and wipe down the tops of the workbenches, removing the invisible film of salt and soot that settles on everything in this room. My life is a constant battle against this film, a never-ending cycle of cleaning what will only become dirty again by morning. I sit back down on my stool and look at my hands. They are grey, the skin parched and peeling from the various spirits and heats they have endured. I begin to rub a little lard into the cracks of my knuckles, a slow, soothing motion that is the only luxury I allow myself at the end of the day. The fire in the furnace is now just a bed of glowing embers, and the laboratory is colder than it was an hour ago. I prepare to sit through the final hours of the night, watching the last of the liquid drip into the receiver, a sentinel of the mundane, waiting for the sun to rise so I can begin the entire process once more. The stillness of the deep night is finally broken by the sound of the heavy iron latch on the coal cellar door, which I must open to replenish the fuel for the coming morning's operations. The hinges scream with a dry, metallic protest that echoes off the vaulted stone ceiling, a sound that feels violent in the otherwise tomb-like silence of the laboratory. I descend 3 steps into the pit where the anthracite is stored, the air here even colder and more stagnant than in the main room. I begin to shovel the coal into a heavy wicker basket, the iron spade biting into the heap with a repetitive, jarring crunch. Each shovelful weighs upon my tired wrists, and I find myself counting the pieces of coal as they tumble into the basket, a mindless tally to keep the creeping exhaustion from overwhelming my senses. 1, 2, 3, 22. When the basket is full, I heave it up to my shoulder, feeling the rough wicker bite through my tunic, and carry it back to the furnace. I do this 4 times. It is a common porter's labor, devoid of any mystery, yet it is the very foundation of my art. Without the coal, there is no heat. Without heat, there is no transformation. Without transformation, there is only the cold, dark stone. Once the fuel is staged, I turn my attention to the preparation of the white lead paste, a substance I use to coat the interiors of certain ceramic vessels to prevent the seepage of corrosive salts. I take a block of pure soft lead and a heavy iron rasp. I begin to file the metal. The sound is a low, rhythmic grate, 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 and a pile of dull, silvery shavings begins to accumulate on the parchment below. My arm moves in a steady back-and-forth motion, a pendulum of grey industry. I must produce 3 ounces of these shavings. It takes nearly an hour of constant filing, the muscles in my forearm burning with a slow, acidic fire. When the pile is sufficient, I transfer the shavings to a glass jar and add a measured quantity of sharp vinegar. The reaction is not immediate. It is a slow, invisible hunger as the acid begins to bite into the metal. I must stir this mixture every 10 minutes for the next 6 hours. I sit on my stool, the stirring rod in my hand, and wait. To fill the intervals, I begin to clean the soot from the high window slit, a task I have neglected for months. I must climb a rickety wooden ladder, each rung groaning under my weight. I take a rag soaked in stale urine. The ammonia is the only thing that will cut through the thick, greasy carbon, and begin to scrub the small panes of glass. The smell is pungent and foul, rising in the enclosed space to sting my eyes and throat. I rub in small circular motions, pressing hard against the glass until my fingers ache. I can see the moon now, a pale, indifferent sliver through the patch of clarity I have created. I move the ladder 3 inches to the left and begin the next pane. Scrub, press, wipe. It is a miserable, dizzying task performed in the rafters, where the heat of the day has trapped the worst of the laboratory's fumes. By the time the window is clear, my clothes are damp with sweat, despite the midnight chill, and my hands are stained a deep, mottled grey. I descend the ladder carefully, my knees trembling from the exertion, and return to the lead vinegar mixture. I stir it for the 12th time. The liquid is beginning to turn a cloudy, milky white. I then move to the corner where the storage crates are kept, for I must sort through a new shipment of crucibles that arrived late yesterday. They are packed in dry straw, and I must pull each one out, wipe away the dust, and inspect the base for any wobbles. A crucible that does not sit flat on the furnace floor is a liability. I place each one on a flat marble slab and give it a gentle tap. If it rings with a clear bell-like tone, it is sound. If it thuds, it is cracked. Clink, clink, thud. I set the rejected one aside to be crushed and used as grog for future clay work. I do this for 30 crucibles, a symphony of small ceramic voices. The straw gets into my hair and under my collar, itching intolerably. But I do not stop until the last one is indexed and shelved. My eyes are now burning with a fierce, dry heat, the result of the constant exposure to wood smoke and the strain of working by candlelight. I reach for a jar of rosewater I distilled last spring and dab a little on my eyelids, the cool moisture providing a momentary reprieve. I look at the water clock. 2 more hours until the first light of dawn. I decide to use this time to sharpen the brass dividers and the iron scribes I use for marking the glass. I take a fine-grained whetstone and a drop of oil, and I begin the slow, circular grinding. The sound is almost hypnotic, a tiny metallic whisper that seems to fill the entire room. I focus on the point of the scribe, trying to make it as sharp as a needle's tip. I test it against my thumbnail, feeling the microscopic bite of the metal. It is not sharp enough. I resume the grinding, round and round, round and round. The candle wax has formed a vast translucent lake on the table, and I find myself tracing the edges of it with my free hand, feeling the transition from the smooth, hard surface to the soft, tacky center. This is my life, a series of small tactile observations, a long-form meditation on the properties of matter and the passage of time. I am not a sorcerer. I am a janitor of the elements, a man who spends his nights ensuring that the glass is clean, the coal is ready, and the lead is slowly, painfully turning white. The great secret of alchemy is not the formula for gold, but the endurance required to survive the crushing, repetitive boredom of the laboratory without losing one's mind to the shadows. I stir the lead again. The white cloud in the jar is thicker now, a pale ghost of the metal it once was. I wait for the next 10 minutes to pass, my head nodding toward my chest, the rhythm of my own breathing, the only clock that truly matters in this windowless world of stone and salt. The leaden light of the new morning begins to filter through the freshly scrubbed window, casting a pale, clinical glow over the wreckage of my night's labor. The lead white paste has finally reached the consistency of thick cream, and now comes the painstaking task of applying it to the interior of the ceramic distillation vessels. I take a brush made of fine badger hair and dip it into the white sludge. I must reach my arm deep into the narrow neck of each jar, twisting my wrist at an awkward straining angle to ensure an even coating. The smell of the vinegar-soaked lead is sharp and metallic, a scent that seems to coat the back of my throat in a layer of cold dust. I apply the paste in long overlapping strokes, feeling the resistance of the clay against the bristles. Each jar takes 20 minutes of careful maneuvering. I have 12 jars. My arm begins to cramp, a dull throb starting at the elbow and radiating down to the tips of my stained fingers, but I cannot stop. If the paste dries unevenly, it will flake off under the heat of the furnace, contaminating the entire batch of spirits. I work with a grim mechanical persistence, my mind retreating into a state of numb vacuum where only the movement of the brush exists. Dip, reach, swirl, smooth. When the final jar is coated, I must set them all on a high shelf near the chimney to dry slowly. This requires me to lift the heavy wet clay vessels above my head, my muscles quivering under the weight as I carefully guide them into place on the dusty timber. Once they are positioned, I turn my attention to the heap of used linen filters from yesterday's oak extraction. They are stiff and stained a deep, ugly brown, clotted with the bitter dregs of the bark. They cannot be discarded. Linen is expensive, and so I must wash them. I fill a large wooden tub with boiling water and a scoop of caustic potash. I plunge my hands into the water. The heat is nearly unbearable, turning my skin a bright, angry red, and I begin to scrub the fabric against a fluted wooden board. Rub, rinse, wring. Rub, rinse, wring. The water quickly turns into a dark, opaque soup, and the steam rising from the tub carries the acrid scent of the potash, making my eyes water and my nose burn. I scrub until the stains fade to a pale tan, my knuckles raw and stinging from the harshness of the lye. After 2 hours of washing, I carry the heavy, dripping pile of linen to the courtyard to hang them on a hemp line. The air outside is biting and sharp, a shock to my lungs after the humid warmth of the laboratory. I stand for a moment, watching the grey clouds move across the sky, feeling the wind pull at my hair, before the duty of the fire calls me back inside. I must now grind a basket of dried eggshells into a fine calcium powder. This is perhaps the most tedious task of the week. The shells are brittle and light, and as I strike them with the heavy stone pestle, they shatter into thousands of tiny sharp shards that fly up and stick to my sweaty face and arms. I must grind them for hours to reach the required fineness. A repetitive thud crunch that resonates through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. My shoulders feel as though they are being ground between two millstones themselves. I stop only to sift the powder through a fine silk mesh, watching the white dust settle in a thick layer over everything. My workbench, my tools, the very air I breathe. I am becoming a white ghost, a man made of calcium and ash. I then take a small iron spoon and begin to measure the powder into parchment packets, each one containing exactly ½ an ounce. I use a small brass balance, adding the powder grain by grain until the scales tip. Too much. Remove 3 grains. Too little. Add 2 grains. I do this 100 times. The sun has reached its zenith. Yet I have not moved more than 10 paces from my mortar. My existence has been reduced to the weight of an eggshell and the texture of a linen rag. I find myself staring at the grain of the wooden workbench, tracing the intricate patterns of the oak for minutes at a time, lost in a trance of total, soul-crushing boredom. There is no magic here. There is only the slow, relentless erosion of the self against the demands of the material world. A life measured in the cleaning of filters and the grinding of bone. A long grey sleep of the spirit performed in the name of a science that demands everything and promises nothing but the next day's labor. The afternoon sun has begun its slow, heavy descent, casting long skeletal shadows across the laboratory floor. But for me, it only signals the beginning of the great cleaning of the furnace grates. This is a task of absolute filth and necessity. I must wait for the secondary furnace to cool just enough that I can reach inside without the skin blistering off my palms. Yet it must remain warm enough that the clinkers, those stubborn glass-like fused masses of ash and impurities, have not yet frozen to the iron bars. I don an apron of heavy cracked leather and kneel before the iron maw. With a long hooked poker, I begin to scrape. The sound is a jarring metallic shriek, scritch, thud, scritch, as I pry the hardened slag from the grates. The soot rises in a thick, suffocating cloud, coating my face, entering my lungs, and turning my sweat into rivulets of black ink that run down my neck. I must reach deep into the flue, my arm wreathed in the grey ghost of past fires, feeling blindly for the obstructions that stifle the draft. It takes nearly 2 hours of back-breaking labor to clear a space no larger than a man's head. When the grates are finally clear, I must haul the buckets of hot ash to the leaching vat in the corner. I do not waste the ash. I pour it into a large wooden tun and cover it with water to begin the weeks-long process of extracting potash. I stir the grey slurry with a heavy pole, a thick, resistance-heavy movement that feels like stirring a vat of wet sand. Swish, drag, swish. The water turns a caustic, ghostly grey. My muscles are screaming now, a dull, thrumming ache in the small of my back. that makes every movement a deliberate act of will. To recover my breath, I turn to the rendering of animal fat for the lamps. I have a bucket of raw sweet, cold and white, and smelling of the butcher's block. I take a small sharp knife and begin to dice the fat into tiny uniform cubes. Slice, thud, slice. My fingers become coated in a slippery translucent film that makes it difficult to hold the handle. Once diced, the fat goes into a copper pan over a tiny flame. I must stand over it, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon so it does not scorch. The smell is thick and cloying. The scent of a kitchen, but without the promise of a meal. I watch as the white solids slowly dissolve into a clear golden oil, leaving behind the cracklings, the shriveled remains of connective tissue. I strain the hot oil through a piece of scorched canvas into a stone jar, watching the liquid gold pool at the bottom. This oil will keep my candles burning through the next 3 nights of vigils. It is a cycle of labor that feeds itself. I work to make the light, so that I may see to do the work. I then spend the next hour seated on the floor, using a piece of pumice to scrub the grease from the copper pan, for even a hint of old fat will ruin the purity of the next day's distillations. My movements have become slow and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. I find myself counting the drips of water from the leaky ceiling. 1, 2, 3, matching my breathing to the rhythm of the dampness. The world outside is preparing for the evening meal, for the closing of shops and the lighting of hearths. But here, the time is marked only by the gradual cooling of the iron and the slow accumulation of clean tools. I pick up a bundle of goose quills and begin the tedious process of scraping the membranes from the barrels so they can be used for writing. I use a small penknife, peeling away the translucent skin in long curling strips. It is a delicate, mindless task that requires a steady hand and an infinite amount of patience. I do this for 20 quills, one after the other, until my eyes blur and the white feathers become a single shimmering mass in the dim light. There is no end to the preparation, no moment where the laboratory is ready. It is a constant state of decay being fought back by the constant application of my own exhausted hands. I look at the pile of quill shavings on the floor and realize they look exactly like the lead shavings from this morning. And for a moment, I cannot remember which task I'm currently performing. The boredom has become a physical weight, a fog that settles over the mind, leaving only the mechanical impulse to continue, to clean, to grind, to wait. The light has now retreated into a single, bruised line of violet on the horizon, and the laboratory has surrendered its shapes to the thick, swallowing shadows of the evening. I must now attend to the sorting of the sands. Not all heat is the same, and the sand bath, the balneum arena, requires a specific hierarchy of grains to ensure the glass does not shatter under the uneven pressure of the flame. I have 3 heavy sacks of river sand that were hauled here by mule last week. They are damp and clotted with river silt and small useless pebbles. I begin the process of drying the sand by spreading it in thin layers over the flat top of the cooling furnace. I use a wooden rake to furrow the grit, increasing the surface area so the moisture can escape in thin, invisible plumes of steam. Once dry, I must sift it. I have a series of 3 brass sieves, ranging from the width of a pea to the fineness of a silk thread. I sit on a low stool and begin to shake the first sieve. Rattle, hiss, rattle. The sound is like a dry rain against a parchment roof. My shoulders, already stiff from the day's burdens, protest with every vibration. I sift the entire first sack, separating the coarse stones from the medium grit. Then I take the medium grit and pass it through the second sieve. The dust rises in a fine golden cloud, coating my eyelashes and settling into the creases of my lips, giving every breath the taste of ancient stone. I do not rush. To rush is to allow a large grain into the fine bed, which creates a hot spot that will crack a vessel worth more than a month of my labor. I spend 3 hours in this rhythmic swaying motion, my body becoming a pendulum of industry. After the sand is sorted into 3 distinct heaps, I must wash the finest grade in distilled vinegar to remove any traces of lime or seashell that might react with the heat. I pour the sand into a ceramic basin and add the acid. It hisses, a tiny aggressive sound of 1,000 microscopic bubbles bursting. I stir the heavy wet sludge with a glass rod, feeling the friction of the grains against the bottom. Scrape, swirl, scrape. My wrists throb with a dull, persistent ache. I must then rinse the sand 5 times with pure water until the sting of the vinegar is gone. Each rinse involves pouring the water, stirring, waiting for the sand to settle, and then decanting the cloudy liquid into a waste bucket. It is a test of the soul's endurance. Between the rinsings, I move to the workbench to polish the brass weights of the balance. These weights are the heart of my measurements, yet they are constantly tarnished by the acidic fumes of the room. I take a piece of soft chamois leather and a paste of crushed rotten stone and oil. I pick up the 1 ounce weight, a small cold cylinder of yellow metal, and begin to rub. I move the leather in tight circular motions, pressing with the ball of my thumb until the metal grows warm from the friction. I do this until I can see the distorted reflection of my own tired eye in the brass surface. I have a set of 20 weights, from the heavy pound block to the tiny grain-sized slivers that I must handle with silver tweezers. I polish each one with the same meticulous, maddening care. My world shrinks to the size of a brass grain and the texture of the leather. The silence of the room is so profound that I can hear the sound of the oil creeping up the wick of the lamp, a tiny capillary hiss. I realize that I have spent the last hour in total silence, my mind completely devoid of thought, occupied only by the sensation of the brass turning from dull brown to gleaming gold. This is the alchemy of time, the turning of hours into nothingness. I return to the sand, which is now clean and ready to be spread. I take a flat trowel and begin to layer the sand into the heating pans, smoothing it until it is as level as the surface of a stagnant pond. I use a ruler to check the depth at every corner. Exactly 2 inches, no more, no less. This is the foundation upon which the night's distillation will rest. My fingers are raw, my eyes are dim, and my back is a column of pain. Yet the work demands one final task before I can allow myself to sit in the darkness. The cleaning of the soot-clogged flues of the small portable brazier. I take a long, flexible wire with a brush of hog bristles and feed it into the narrow pipe. Scrub, pull, scrub. A shower of black carbon falls onto the floor, and I begin the process of sweeping once again. There is no triumph here, no gold in the pan, only the quiet, heavy knowledge that the laboratory is clean, the sand is sorted, and the fire is ready to be lit for the 100th time. The violet line of the horizon has long since vanished, replaced by an absolute suffocating blackness that only the small flickering heart of my furnace dares to challenge. I now turn my attention to the preparation of the virgin earth. a tedious process of triple distilling common red clay to strip it of its organic impurities. I have a large mound of raw, clotted earth on the floor, still damp from the creek bed. My first task is to break the clumps by hand. I kneel in the dust, my fingers sinking into the cold, sticky mass, feeling for stones, roots, or the small calcified shells of snails. Each impurity must be pinched out and discarded. Squeeze, pull, toss. I do this for 2 hours, my hands becoming heavy gloves of drying mud that cracks and pulls at the fine hairs on my skin. Once the clay is cleaned of visible debris, I must force it through a fine wire mesh to ensure a uniform consistency. I take a wooden block and press the damp earth through the screen, a labor that requires me to lean the full weight of my chest against my arms. The clay resists. It oozes through the wires in thin, worm-like strands that I gather into a ceramic vat. Push, scrape, gather. The air is filled with the scent of wet basements and ancient rain. This refined clay must then be mixed with a massive quantity of distilled water until it becomes a thin, watery slip. I take a heavy oaken paddle and begin to stir. The resistance of the liquid is deceptive. It starts light, but as the clay suspends, it becomes a thick, dragging weight that pulls at my shoulders with every rotation. I stir for 1,000 strokes. I count them to keep my mind from wandering into the dark corners of the room where the shadows seem to move. 412. 413. The sound is a wet, rhythmic slop-slosh. Slop-slosh that begins to feel like the heartbeat of the room itself. When the stirring is done, the vat must sit for 3 hours to allow the heaviest sand to settle to the bottom. I use this interval to attend to the charcoal sorting. I have a fresh delivery of mixed coals, oak, willow, and pine, all jumbled together in a single burlap sack. For the great work, the source of the fire is as important as the fire itself. Pine burns hot and fast, useful for the initial melting. Oak burns steady and long, the backbone of the night watch. Willow produces a gentle, soft heat for the most delicate distillations. I sit on the floor and begin to sort the black stones by the texture of their bark and the weight of their carbonized hearts. I pick up a piece, feel the ridges with my thumb, and place it in the appropriate pile. Oak, oak, willow, pine, oak. My hands are already black, so the soot no longer matters. I have become part of the darkness. I spend the better part of the night in this silent, tactile categorization. The dust enters my nostrils and turns my phlegm to ink. After the coal is sorted, I return to the clay vat. I must now siphon off the top layer of water, leaving the refined earth at the bottom. I use a long glass tube, drawing the liquid out by mouth. A dangerous, bitter task that leaves the taste of grit and minerals on my tongue. I spit the excess into a bucket and watch the level of the vat slowly drop. The remaining sludge is the virgin earth, which must now be spread onto flat tiles to dry under the residual heat of the furnace. I take a small trowel and spread the grey mud in thin, even sheets, smoothing the surface until it shines like wet silk. I must ensure there are no air bubbles. I spend an hour pricking the surface with a needle, watching the tiny pockets of air collapse. This earth will eventually be calcined until it turns white. But that is a task for 3 days from now. My life is a series of such postponements, preparing today for a process that will not begin until the week is half over. I look at my reflection in the dark water of the rinse bucket. I am a man of grey skin and hollow eyes. a creature of the laboratory who has forgotten the feeling of the sun on his back. I reach for a piece of pumice and begin the nightly ritual of scrubbing my nails, the stone grinding away the layers of clay and soot in a slow, abrasive penance. The fire in the furnace is a low orange eye, watching me as I prepare the wicks for the morning lamps, dipping the hemp strings into the melted fat I rendered earlier. Dip, hang, cool. Dip, hang, cool. The repetition is the only thing that keeps the silence from becoming unbearable. I am a weaver of small certainties in a world of vast alchemical unknowns, and as the first hint of grey light touches the high window, I realize I have spent another 12 hours doing nothing more than moving earth from one place to another. The grey, indifferent light of another dawn begins to crawl down the damp stone walls, and with it comes the realization that the mercurial water I set to evaporate 3 days ago has finally reached its critical point of concentration. I move toward the back of the laboratory, where a row of wide, shallow glass basins sits atop a bed of lukewarm ashes. The liquid has been reduced by half, leaving a thin, crystalline crust around the edges that glimmers like frost on a winter pond. Now begins the painstaking labor of the gentle collection. I take a small curved scraper made of polished silver, as iron would contaminate the salt, and begin to flake away the crystals. I must move with the lightness of a thief. If I press too hard, the glass will scratch. If I move too fast, the fine white powder will catch the draft and vanish into the air like smoke. Scrape, gather, brush. I spend 2 hours hunched over a single basin, my neck locked in a painful curve, my eyes straining to distinguish the translucent crystals from the clear glass beneath them. The sound is a microscopic, high-pitched skr that vibrates through the silver tool and into my very teeth. Once the crystals are collected, they must be weighed against the original volume of the water to determine the spirit's strength. I return to the balance. I spend 30 minutes just leveling the scales, adjusting the tiny screw at the fulcrum by fractions of a hair's breadth until the needle stands perfectly vertical, as motionless as a dead man's pulse. I add the crystals grain by grain, using a tiny brush to sweep every last speck from the gathering tray. The measurement must be recorded in my ledger, but the ink has frozen in the well overnight. I have to hold the ceramic ink pot over the furnace embers, swirling the black liquid until it thaws. The scent of oak galls and vinegar rising in a sharp, familiar puff of steam. I write the figures with a trembling hand, the numbers small and cramped. 12 grains of the salt, 3 ounces of the phlegm. This record is the only proof that these hours of my life ever existed. After the recording, I turn to the copper instruments, the great funnel, the stirring rods, and the heavy cooling coil of the worm still. Copper is a restless metal. It breathes the air and turns green with a bitter, poisonous verdigris that must be removed before every use. I take a pot of coarse salt, mixed with the juice of crushed lemons and a thick rag of burlap. I begin to scrub. The acid and the grit grind against the metal, a harsh, rhythmic shock, shock, shock that fills the room with the smell of a wet shipyard. My fingers soon burn from the acid, the skin puckering and turning a sickly yellow-white. But I do not stop until the copper shines with a dull sunset glow. I must then rinse the instruments in 3 different bars of rainwater, drying them immediately with a clean silk cloth so that no water spots remain. Each spot is an impurity. Each impurity is a failure. I spend the entire mid-morning in this cycle of scrubbing and drying. my arms moving in long sweeping arcs that leave me breathless and light-headed. To ground myself, I begin the task of sorting the animal spirits, a collection of dried hartshorn and calcined bone that must be ground into a powder of uniform density. I use a heavy iron mortar that has been warmed by the fire. The bone is stubborn. It resists the pestle with a dry, hollow clack, before finally splintering into grit. I grind for 3 hours. The white dust rises and coats my damp skin, turning me into a statue of salt and ash. I do not think of the gold. I do not think of the elixir. I think only of the weight of the pestle and the number of strokes required to reach the center of the pile. 100, 101, 102. My world has narrowed to the diameter of the mortar's mouth. When the grinding is done, I must sift the bone dust through a screen of fine horsehair. I shake the frame back and forth, a gentle, vibrating motion that sends a cloud of white powder into the air, settling on the tables, the jars, and the folds of my clothes. I am breathing the remains of ancient creatures, their calcified lives becoming the dust of my own. I look at the floor and see the patterns of my footsteps in the ash. A map of a man who has walked 20 miles today, without ever leaving a 10-foot circle. The sun is now high, yet the air in the laboratory remains heavy with the scent of wet earth, burnt fat, and the metallic tang of the copper. I sit back on my stool and watch a single drop of condensation form on the tip of the cooling coil. It gathers, hangs, and finally falls, a tiny silver heartbeat in the silence. I wait for the next one, my mind as empty and grey as the ash pit, surrendered to the infinite crushing weight of the mundane.